Some people think they can measure another person's life in the first 30 seconds after meeting them. They notice the way you dress, the way you stand, the way you speak. Then they quietly decide exactly who you are. My brother-in-law made that decision about me before we had even finished shaking hands. His name was Ethan, a Green Beret, the kind of man who had earned every bit of respect attached to that title. He carried himself with quiet confidence, and no one in the family could stop talking about him. Every holiday dinner somehow turned into another story about one of his training schools, deployments, or military experiences. To be honest, he deserved a lot of that admiration. Serving your country is something to be respected. The only problem was, everyone assumed he was the only veteran sitting at the table. I never corrected them. After leaving the Army, I had built a completely different life. These days, I taught American history at the local high school. My mornings were spent explaining the Constitution to teenagers who were more interested in lunch than homework. Most afternoons ended with stacks of essays waiting to be graded at the kitchen table. It was a quiet life, exactly the one I wanted. My wife understood that. She had known me long before anyone called me Sergeant. She also knew there was a reason I never spoke about those years unless someone genuinely asked. The family barbecue was supposed to be simple: good food, bad jokes, kids running through the backyard with water balloons, nothing more. I was standing beside the grill helping my father-in-law flip hamburgers when I noticed Ethan walking toward us. He smiled, reached out his hand, and gave mine a firm shake. Not the kind meant to be friendly. The kind meant to test someone. His eyes drifted over my shoulders, my posture, and the faded scar near my left wrist. Then he smiled again. This time, it carried just a little too much confidence. He asked what I did for a living. When I told him I was a history teacher, he nodded politely. That single answer seemed to confirm everything he already believed about me. A few minutes later, I overheard him laughing with two cousins near the patio. He never lowered his voice. Some people are built for classrooms, others are built for the real world. The comment was followed by a few awkward laughs. I looked down at the spatula in my hand and smiled to myself. He was wrong, not because I had something to prove, but because he had judged a chapter after reading only the title. If you have ever been underestimated because you chose a quiet life, stay with me. This story is only getting started. Lunch had barely ended when someone dragged a pair of folding mats out onto the lawn. It started the way most family competitions do. One cousin wanted to see a simple self-defense demonstration. Another insisted Ethan should teach the kids a basic escape technique. Within minutes, half the family had gathered in a loose circle, holding paper plates and cold drinks, while the younger kids pushed to the front for a better view. Ethan did exactly what everyone expected. He explained a few simple movements, answered questions, and laughed with the kids whenever someone copied the technique the wrong way. He was good with people. That was never the problem. The problem arrived when my father-in-law looked in my direction with a grin. "Daniel, why don't you help him out? Just for a quick demonstration." A few heads turned. Before I could answer, Ethan chuckled. He waved one hand as if he had already made the decision. "Do not worry. I will go easy on him." The backyard filled with quiet laughter. Nobody meant any harm. To them, it sounded like harmless teasing. I smiled and set my drink on the picnic table. "Only if you are sure." Ethan nodded. "Absolutely. This will only take a few seconds." My wife looked at me from across the yard. She knew that expression. It was the same calm look I wore before every difficult decision. She also knew I disliked turning family gatherings into competitions. As I stepped onto the mat, Ethan leaned a little closer. His voice dropped just enough that only I could hear it. "I hope I did not offend you." I shook my head. "Not at all." Then I offered him the same advice I gave my high school wrestling team every season. The fastest way to get embarrassed is to underestimate the person standing in front of you. He smiled politely. I could tell he thought I was joking. Around us, conversations stopped. Phones slowly came out. Someone whispered that this was going to be fun. They were right, just not for the reason they expected. The match had not even started, but one of us had already made a mistake. The moment we shook hands, I noticed the same thing I had seen years ago in training. Ethan was confident, maybe a little too confident. He expected me to react first. Instead, I stood for a second. Neither of us moved. The backyard became unusually quiet. Even the kids stopped talking. Then Ethan stepped forward. It was quick, controlled, exactly the kind of movement I expected from someone with years of professional training. I shifted only enough to redirect his balance. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just timing. His momentum carried him a little farther than he intended. Before he could reset, I was already beside him instead of in front of him. A gentle grip on his wrist, a step behind his shoulder. One small adjustment. Suddenly, he was no longer attacking. He was trying to recover. I never forced him down. His own movement did that. The mat caught him first. Then came silence. Real silence. Nobody laughed. Nobody clapped. For several long seconds, the only sound in the backyard was the wind moving through the trees. I loosened my grip immediately and offered him my hand. "Take your time." He looked at me with genuine surprise. Not anger, not embarrassment. Surprise. He accepted my hand, stood up, and brushed the grass from his sleeve. One of my cousins finally broke the silence. How did that happen? Before anyone else could answer, Ethan surprised everyone. He looked at the family, then back at me. That was not luck. His voice carried something it had not carried all afternoon. Respect. He studied me for another moment before asking the question nobody else had thought to ask. "Daniel, where did you learn to move like that?" I smiled, the same way I had been smiling all afternoon. Quietly, because for the first time since we met, he was no longer looking at me like a history teacher. He was looking at me like someone whose story he had not finished reading. And I still had not told him who I really was. Nobody rushed back to the barbecue. The food was still on the tables. The kids had gone back to playing. But the adults stayed where they were, as if the match had interrupted more than just lunch. Ethan walked over carrying 2 bottles of water. He handed me one before sitting on the edge of the mat. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. "I have been trying to figure you out since we met this morning." I laughed quietly. "There is not much to figure out." He shook his head. "There is. Nobody moves like that without years of training. You stayed calm the entire time. You never chased me. You waited. That is something people learn through experience, not YouTube videos." I looked toward the backyard where my students would have been if this had been one of our school field days. "Most people know me as a teacher. That is enough for me." Ethan nodded slowly. Then he asked the question again. This time there was no pride in his voice, only curiosity. "So, where did you learn it?" I finally answered. Years ago, before I ever stepped into a classroom, I served as an Army Ranger. A knee injury ended that chapter earlier than I expected. When I came home, I decided I wanted a life where nobody measured me by my uniform. Teaching gave me that chance. The backyard became quiet again. My father-in-law stared at me for several seconds before speaking. "All these years, you never mentioned any of this." I shrugged. It never seemed important. Service is something you do. It is not something you introduce yourself with. Ethan looked down for a moment. When he looked back up, the confidence that had filled every conversation earlier that day had been replaced by something much rarer: respect. He smiled and held out his hand again. This time, it was not a test. It was simply one professional thanking another. And that handshake meant far more than winning a match ever could. For the first time that day, my family stopped seeing what I did for a living and started understanding who I was. The rest of the afternoon felt different. Not because anyone kept talking about the match. Nobody did. Instead, the conversation drifted back to food, family, and stories that had nothing to do with the military. It was exactly what I had hoped for. As the sun began to set, I stepped onto the back porch with a cup of coffee. A minute later, the screen door opened behind me. Ethan walked outside. He rested his arms on the railing and looked across the backyard where the kids were still chasing each other through the grass. For a while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he broke the silence. "I owe you an apology." He let out a quiet laugh. "Not because you put me on the mat. Because I decided who you were before I knew anything about you." I looked at him and smiled. "We have all done that at some point. The important part is recognizing it." He nodded. Then he admitted something I respected even more than his military career. When someone wears a title long enough, it becomes easy to believe that title tells the whole story. Today reminded me that it does not. We shook hands one last time. Hands one last time. This one felt completely different from the first. There was no test, no competition, just mutual respect. As we walked back toward the house, my father-in-law looked at us, smiled, and jokingly asked whether there would be a rematch next summer. Ethan answered before I could. "No, I already learned the lesson I came here to learn." Everyone laughed. This time, I laughed too. Because the best victories are not the ones that leave someone embarrassed. They are the ones that leave everyone wiser. Some people spend their lives trying to prove they are the strongest person in the room. The strongest people I have ever met never felt the need to prove anything at all. Before you go, tell me in the comments, what country are you watching from? What kind of story would you like next? Military respect, family betrayal, courtroom justice, workplace revenge, or another unforgettable true-to-life drama? If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Public Evidence and turn on the bell icon so you never miss our next original story.